Welcome to Hot Sectors with me, Punita Kumar Sinha. Here we take a 360-degree view of the sectors that have seen policy initiatives and analyze the challenges and investment opportunities that lie in them. Today we look at India's telecom sector, which is facing a lot of regulatory uncertainty. Recent spectrum auctions are not seeing many bids, and there's no clarity about whether the government will reduce spectrum prices or not. So what does this mean for the financial health of the telecom sector? I'm joined by Akhil Gupta of Bharti, Suresh Mahadevan of UBS and S. Narain of ICICI Prudential to answer just that. Now joining me on the show is Akhil Gupta, Deputy Group CEO and MD Bharti Enterprises. Akhil, great to have you with us today. Let me begin by asking you, what is your view of the cost of spectrum for 900 MHz and 1800 MHz and the fact that it's a moving target?
Well, I think very clearly the first round has shown that the response had not been too good, which means the price has been very high. And we do believe that the price should be lowered, but I guess it's an auction, so the auction would decide what the discovered price is.
Based on the recent bidding process, it is clear that companies are not bidding. Is that a deliberate attempt by companies to bring down the reserve prices? What is your view?
Well, bidding is a function of a bidder finding whether the price is good or not. So there's nothing about deliberate or non-deliberate in that. I think people will take a call whether the reserve price which is there is worth bidding for or not.
Do you believe that it is fair for 2G prices to be pegged to 3G?
Well, quite clearly I think that, as has been mentioned by all the operators, the prices which have been reserved seem to be too high. Pegging 2G to a 3G kind of price is apparently not the right thing to do. But the good thing is there are auctions, and therefore the price would be discovered in an auction, whatever is the right price.
So you think people actually bid too high for 3G?
I think 3G auction, if you see, with very, very limited spectrum available, was a bit of an artificial high price which it commanded. So yes, I think the answer to your question, whether the bids were too high, artificially high in 3G, is absolutely yes.
Akhil, how do you see the dispute between the companies and the government resolving? Is there more scope for litigation?
Well, I think there is no dispute in as much as, a price discovery mechanism by way of auction is concerned. The other disputes are quite a few, and I think both the government and the operators are trying to work towards it. But as far as the spectrum pricing is concerned, I think that is an established norm that there are going to be auctions and a discovered price is to be found.
When do you expect the regulatory overhang to get better?
Well, I think there are a few regulatory big overhangs still. One-time license fee which is sub judice. We have got stays against that. The price to be discovered for extension of licenses, the dispute between extension versus renewal. I think some of these issues remain, and hopefully within the next few months these should get settled.
So do you think the environment is stable enough today for the telecom companies to invest further? Are there specific measures that you would like to see?
Well, I think the specific measures are certainly to get on with the spectrum pricing issues and resolve them amicably, and not have the mindset of maximizing the money which can be extracted out of this sector.
Akhil, now how easy will it be for you to raise tariffs? Would the regulator actually allow you to raise tariffs given the increased costs?
Well, the increased cost would have to be passed on, because otherwise the sector is in a doldrum if the companies really are not in good financial position. The tariffs, as you know, are under forbearance, and it need not necessarily be a matter that big increases in tariff overall rates have to take place. What I feel the industry has to do is to take off a lot of promotional schemes and discounts which are being offered, which is now being done, to rationalize these prices rather than make a massive hike.
And when do you see tariffs converging to international levels? As you know, India has one of the lowest telecom tariffs in the world.
Never. I don't think in India the tariffs will ever converge to international levels, and there is no need. I think it just needs to rationalize a bit. It needs to, the realized rate needs to definitely go up, but nobody is talking about anywhere even remotely near the international levels.
With tariffs rising, do you see it impacting subscriber growth? The recent data is actually showing plateauing of subscriber growth, right?
That, Punita, is more a measure of coming to a more rational way of looking at sales and distribution expenses. The unmitigated competition which was thrown out in this industry led to a situation that there were a set of some operators whose only task was to build up the telecom subscriber numbers, and so they started paying irrational commissions in the market. So I think some of that led to just rotational churn. Most of those customers which were coming in were not necessarily brand new customers, they were just rotating, and I think some of those measures have been taken by the industry to rationalize the sales and distribution commissions. So that has seen the drop in the acquisition numbers.
Moving forward, do you see the telecom sector consolidating in India to just 3 or 4 players like we have in the rest of Asia?
Well, a lot of consolidation has certainly already happened. As a result of the Supreme Court judgment, some of the players have just gone out. So some consolidation has happened. I don't expect some very major M&A action between the existing players. I think competition commission rules and other things will come in between that. But yes, there could be change of hands and ownership of some of the companies that can't be ruled out.
Akhil, now shifting to data services, in other global companies, data services is a large part of their profitability, but in India it's very low. Do you see that changing?
So I think contrary to popular belief, the data growth in India is actually quite large right now. And just to give the data, and these are published data from Airtel, Idea and other players, the data traffic has been growing at roughly about 25% sequentially quarter to quarter. Now that's a pretty good growth. In the last 3 quarters, it has more or less doubled. So that's a very healthy growth. We are seeing the number of 3G customers increasing by over 25% quarter to quarter. The overall traffic increasing by that. So I think in terms of data, I am personally pretty happy the way data is growing in India.
Akhil, final question. You've been in the telecom sector since inception. Do you think the environment is better today, or was it better earlier?
I'm very hopeful that with some of the measures which I mentioned, the rationalization of the expenditure, rationalization of the realized rates, more growth of data, spread out of the 3G networks to enable the common man across the country to access internet on the mobile. I think all these do bring hope, and I'm sure with the cooperation between the industry and the government and the regulator, we should be able to overcome the problems which we have faced so far.
Thank you very much for that, Akhil.
Thank you, Punita.
That was Akhil Gupta of Bharti, who believes that it is very important that the financial health of the sector improves and that price discovery on spectrum auctions be determined to attract further investment. We're talking about investment opportunities in the telecom sector. I have joining me Suresh Mahadevan, MD and Head of Equities, UBS Securities. Suresh has over a decade's experience covering the intricacies of the telecom sector. Suresh, thank you very much for joining us. Suresh, let me begin by asking you, you like the telecom sector despite the regulatory uncertainties. So what about excess spectrum quota and the license fees? How are companies going to be able to deal with that uncertainty?
Typically, internationally, what happens is when a spectrum term ends, for a nominal fee, it is extended. Whereas in India, we are going for auctions, possibly because of the Supreme Court decision. But I think the problem is the health of the industry here is, the balance sheets of the sector is pretty weak. I think even the top players have leverage of at least 2.5 times EBITDA. But if you go beyond the top 3, I think the leverage increases significantly. Reliance Com is over 5, and some of the other 5 times EBITDA, that is. And some of the others like Tata Docomo and Aircel, they don't even make a proper EBITDA. So those numbers look very unreasonable.
But what if the reserve prices don't come down? What will that do to investment in that sector and the congestion and what that means for consumers?
Actually, I think you raised a very, very interesting point around, the congestion, etc. Because if you look at India, I think there are 2 things where we are fundamentally going wrong versus other international practices. One is we basically have way too many operators. So that itself ensures that there is less spectrum per operator. To complicate things further, I think there are departments like space and defense, etc., which are sitting on enormous amounts of spectrum, which makes it even harder, which is why you see the congestion you experience in during peak hours in the large cities. I think just to give you an example, there is 60 megahertz of spectrum available in 3G, but India has auctioned only 20. So essentially, we have auctioned only 1/3 of what is available, which is ridiculous, because if this country's fixed line network is not able to scale up to support broadband, with a young country which really has a lot of latent demand for data services, you're basically choking that demand by not releasing spectrum. So this is something I think the finance minister should note, because this is a huge revenue earning opportunity as well. So that is as far as congestion is concerned. Now coming to your original question about what if these high reserve prices stick, which basically means Bharti, Idea, Vodafone will bid at these reserve prices. I think they are themselves to blame, no? If there is a reserve price and if the operators don't bid, what happens is the government revises them down. And I think we have seen that in the November auction.
How do you see the litigation impact the sector's growth prospects going forward?
See, I think if the government tries to do anything unreasonable, I think the operators will take the litigation route. I think it's very, very clear.
Suresh, I noticed your very high earnings growth estimates, even higher than consensus for the telecom sector. Can you explain what is going to drive this growth?
Yeah, it's primarily led by two things. One is pricing power, which basically gives you a good revenue and margin uplift. And then it's a little bit of deleveraging, because clearly I think a company like Bharti is now generating significant free cash flow. I think some of which will go towards deleveraging the balance sheet. So below the EBITDA line, your interest expenses probably go down.
But you know that mobile penetration is already one of the highest for India as compared to Asia. So what's going to drive further volume growth?
See, I think there are two or three things I would say. First of all, I think clearly urban India is fully penetrated, but rural India may still be only 40% penetrated. So there is still some growth left there. Second thing is, I think we have been selling our mobile minutes way too cheap. I think it has had no relation to costs, operating costs, because companies like Bharti or Idea, their margins have totally got compressed, and we have one of the lowest EBITDA margins. And I think now, given competition is less at the margin, I do think the operators will raise prices. And let me give you one more statistic, that without even raising prices, if the operators were to eliminate all the promotional minutes, they could easily get a 15-20% uplift on the yield per minute.
And what about the threat from Reliance or 4G?
See, I think, this is a view which we have been very clear, that, Reliance currently is not something we need to consider, because they are a greenfield operator. So I think the way out for Reliance is probably to acquire an existing operator, and we believe that could be, Idea, that could be Arcom, that could be somebody else. Though Idea would be easy, because, Idea is economically viable today, whereas Arcom has a huge amount of debt. So it's something we think if Reliance Industries is serious about the telecom business, they may probably want to buy somebody, because that's an easy way for them to get access to the right towers, right customers, because you can't purely run a data business. Reliance Industries, rather than go and bid for spectrum and try to put up a greenfield operation, they may be better off acquiring someone who is existing and who may be willing to sell.
Now Suresh, you obviously have very high earnings growth estimates. Is telecom a growth story for you or a defensive bet? And within this space, what are the stocks you like, and how do you rank them in terms of returns?
Yeah, certainly I think, we think it's going to be a growth sector for the next 4-5 years, primarily around pricing and later around data. That is number one. Second is, I think, we cover today only three names: Bharti, Idea, and Bharti Infratel, which is kind of a derivative. We are positive on all three, but within that, I think we like Bharti the most, Bharti Airtel, that is, because we think this stock has been quite misunderstood by the market in terms of Africa, and it has not been well owned relative to its history. So when the tide changes and when market sees evidence of pricing power, I think this is the stock which people will buy, and it's also a group which has demonstrated good level of corporate governance, etc. So that is number one. We also like Idea. I think Bharti, we have a price target of around 425, which gives probably a 40% kind of upside. Idea we like also at this level, but with a lower upside, I would think more like 30% upside from current levels. Infitel is a very different story. That is a defensive name, though it has some elements of growth. I think that's almost going to give you bond-like returns with maybe 12 to 15% rupee returns every year, irrespective of what the economy does, what the market does.
And finally, Suresh, is Bharti one of your top picks in the sector?
Yes, we have two other products. One is something called Alpha Preferences. We cover around 140 plus names. So 4 or 5 stocks are in that, and Bharti is part of that list, which is Alpha Preference. Over and above this, we have something called a Key Call, which is a top 10 idea across Asia. Bharti also features in that. So it's a reasonably high conviction idea for us.
Well, thank you very much for your time, Suresh. That was Suresh Mahadevan of UBS. He believes that the pricing environment is going to improve for the telecom sector, and he thinks that ARPUs will rise, and therefore he has double-digit earnings growth forecast for the telecom companies. Many mutual funds have been overweight the telecom sector. Let's speak to S. Narain, Chief Investment Officer, Equity, ICICI Prudential AMC, to see why he likes the sector despite all the issues. Narain, thank you very much for joining us. Narain, you're overweight the telecom sector in your funds. Is that a defensive bet, or is there likely growth is going to pick up and therefore you see outperformance?
Yeah, I consider it a defensive bet, but the kind of news action we see in the papers make people believe whether it's defensive or not. Our view is based on the following. Telecom is a basic human necessity, and the prices of the product haven't gone up in years. The level of competitive intensity has been at its maximum, and you have actually a fair amount of negative news coming regularly in the sector. We have always made money by investing when you have such an environment, and disinvesting when the environment turns out to be very positive for any sector.
What are you predicting in terms of earnings growth going forward?
See, I think go back 2-3 years back and ask people to project the earnings per share of any of the telecom companies for 2012-13. I think they came up with a number which turned out to be 100% higher than what it was at this point of time. Similarly, I think it's very difficult to predict what will be the exact earnings per share of any of the telecom companies. What you can clearly see, however, is that you're actually buying towards the bottom of the cycle, whereas in any other consumption sector, you're buying towards the top of the cycle. So that is what we were very clear on, rather than exact earnings of the sector.
What kind of returns are you expecting from the telecom sector, and how do you factor in all the regulatory uncertainty into the valuations, given that any negative announcement can actually hit the performance of these stocks?
If you see over the last 5 years, the sector has delivered no returns. So if by chance their returns were to normalize, then there is a big potential to improve. And actually, when we were super bullish in August, September, from that time itself, the sector has gone up 20% very quietly. And I think even now on a 3 to 5 year basis, it looks like as one of the sectors where you can see absolute upsides much more than what you can see in anything else in the consumption basket.
So you expect this sector to do better than consumer stocks?
I'm expecting much more of an outperformance against the consumption basket.
Are you investing in companies that are leaders in this space, or the leveraged ones which will benefit from the fall in interest rates?
No, we would rather bet on the leaders. So in a sector like telecom, what we have seen is, let's say an operator like AT&T has been in existence for 100 years in US. And I don't think it is easy to believe that the leaders change in this sector. So it's much safer to bet on the leaders. If you invest in the possible companies which can get acquired, you're actually investing in loss-making entities. Some of them, the EBITDAs are all negative. So it's very difficult and too risky for us when we are investing public money to invest in the companies which are likely to get acquired. We would rather be with the leaders who are profitable.
Well, on that note, thank you very much for your views, Narain.
Thanks, Punita.
That was S. Narain from ICICI Prudential AMC, who's overweight telecoms from a long-term perspective. He also believes that the sector is well positioned cyclically for things to improve from here on and that it trades more attractively than other consumer stocks. Now let's talk to Tanveer Gill about what the rest of the market thinks about the telecom sector. Tanveer, what is the rest of the market saying?
Well, I spoke to a lot of analysts, Punita, and they believe that the regulatory risk for the sector has settled a bit. So we're pretty much in the last lap where, you will see more clarity coming in for the entire telecom space. From a valuation perspective, more than price to earnings, it's better to look at the EV per EBITDA for these companies, as that, entails the payments that will come in via debt as well as the equity route. So Bharti Airtel, Reliance Communications, Idea, their EV per EBITDA multiples are anywhere between 8 to 8.5. For Bharti, it's actually lower at about 7 times, and that's likely to reduce going forward into FY14, which I think most analysts are saying would make the sector attractive. The important point is that with no bids coming in for the recent auctions, analysts believe that potentially the reserve price would be lowered, and that would account for lower regulatory payments for the incumbents essentially. So Goldman Sachs has put out its implied value for Bharti at 380 rupees per share and for Idea at 126 rupees per share, which is as a percentage a variance of about 24% from the current market price for Bharti, and for Idea 11%. And that, Punita, just brings me to my question for you, and that is, being an investment manager, how are you profiling the telecom space today?
Tanveer, I have generally preferred not to overweight the telecom sector on a long-term basis, because I have viewed it more as a defensive sector that generally only does well in periods of uncertainty. Now, if you look at the valuations of the Indian telecom companies, they trade like growth stocks. We have currently double-digit earnings growth being forecast for these companies. Valuations, as you yourself have said, actually not cheap. They are much higher than what we see their Asian peers trade at. And I think eventually the sector will head the way other companies trade in Asia, which is more at valuations of utility companies with, companies that have high dividend yields, low earnings growth, and, reasonably low valuations. But in India, of course, we don't have any dividend yield because the financial health of these companies is under question. So I think from that basis, if one really wants to be in the telecom space, you have to have one incumbent market leader, which is financially sound. And then if you obviously want to also invest in one of the leveraged high data companies, that is going to benefit on two counts, one with interest rates coming down, and also potential M&A, which might make one of these companies get acquired, because I think eventually the sector in India has just too many players, and most countries have only 3 or 4 players. So India is also going to go the way we see in the rest of Asia, and there will be a lot more consolidations. Well, that's my view. With that, we come to the end of this episode of Hot Sectors with me, Punita Kumar Sinha. Thank you so much for watching, and have a great day.